Mi gente de Fundiendo con la Biblia, hoy en nuestro episodio número 4 de nuestro podcast de Fundiendo o Fluyendo con la Biblia, estaremos entrevistando a Koller. Aaron es profesor de Próximo Oriente Antiguo en Yeshiva University en Nueva York, y a partir de septiembre será el nuevo Regius Professor of Hebrew de la Universidad de Cambridge. Una alta posición en los estudios del hebreo bíblico, y estaremos hablando sobre judaísmo, ser académico y practicante también del judaísmo. Aarón es practicante junto a su familia del judaísmo, pero también un excelente académico. Hablaremos de esas tensiones y los retos que eso lleva, pero también de escritura judía, de Talmud, Mishnah, y cómo eso se intersecta con Nuevo Testamento y cristianismo. Vaticino un episodio súper interesante. ¿Y vamos? Aaron, really nice to have you this morning or afternoon for some people, right, here in the podcast of Fundiendo con la Biblia.
Thank you so much, Fausto. It's a real honor and pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. It's our honor. Como decimos en español, el placer es nuestro. Can you talk a little bit about yourself?
Yes, absolutely. And I do want to apologize for speaking English here. I could make out most of what you said, but if I had to produce it, it would be terrible. So, yeah, I'm American by birth and raising. Grew up in the Jewish community, first in Baltimore, Maryland, and then New York City, where there's a large, vibrant Jewish community. My academic training took place at a couple of different universities. At some point, it definitely came out of a sense that I wanted to understand my own heritage. So sort of seemed natural to go back to the Hebrew Bible as a origin point. Turns out that the academic study of the Hebrew Bible involves a lot of ancient Near Eastern studies. So I spent a long time studying things like Akkadian and Egyptian, and Ugaritic and all sorts of arcane languages that open up whole worlds. But also I have to say, even for many people in the field, are useful in addition to being the world of Mesopotamia, are also useful because they're the background of the Bible. So they allow us to understand the Bible in its own context. So I went to graduate school more than 25 years ago. I started, and so it's been a good string of studies. And over the course of those decades, I've got my doctorate and started teaching. I've been teaching now for about 16 years at Yeshiva University in New York, which is a Jewish university. I can tell you a little bit more about it, but basically the undergraduate students are all Jewish. The graduate students are everyone, it's a cross-section of people who want to do graduate work in biblical studies. And I specialize mostly in languages, so Hebrew, Aramaic, and other languages like that, and both the Bible, and have also moved a lot in recent years into rabbinic literature. So the Mishnah and the Talmud, which is a few centuries later, and that also involves then, since that's already after the period where Christianity has risen, so also questions of interreligious dialogues and how Judaism and Christianity and then later Islam interacted in the ancient world.
Hey, wow, impressive! Thank you for being
Well,
here.
I didn't say I do it well. I might do it badly, but
I'm sure you do it well. And I know that you practice Judaism. Some of the questions that people made to me all the time and the other contributors to Fundiendo con la Biblia. Actually, I need to explain. Fundiendo con la Biblia is melting with the Bible. So in Spanish, to melt is like to go into deeper conversations.
Okay.
So it's like going deeper into the Bible in some Dominican slang. So some of the questions that people ask is like, how can you be confessional and go into biblical stories? Does that affect your faith, or that prove actually your faith? What has been your experience on
Yeah, it's a great question. It's really a fantastic question because it's a sorry, a deep question on both sides. In other words, as you said, does the academic work affect faith, and also does the faith impact academic work? Which I think, as an academic, that would certainly call into question some of the integrity of the field.
Hmm.
If people sort of came in saying like, I know what my conclusions are going to be because I wear my faith on my sleeve. So now I'm going to go pretend to do scholarship, but actually it's always just going to agree with my previous commitments. That would obviously be a problem on the intellectual side. And then, as you said, faith sometimes doesn't live so well with critical inquiry. And I think for that reason, there's actually have
Mhm.
a lot of directions to take that question. But I'll say just two directions here. One is for that reason, within the Jewish community, critical scholarship on the Bible is not universally accepted. There are lots of more traditional pockets in the community, and that includes even in my own university. So the university has an affiliated seminary. It's not
Yeah.
it's not part of the university in a legal sense, but there's a seminary literally across the street. Most of the students are also studying in a rabbinical seminary. They're not all training to be rabbis, but they're all studying in a rabbinical seminary. And most of the rabbi faculty there actually don't like the fact that there is critical biblical scholarship on campus. They see it as
Mm.
potentially subversive, unnecessarily complicating, because there are issues where faith has always relied on certain claims, and critical scholarship complicates or even just subverts those claims. And, there's this famous line by Stephen Jay Gould, who was really a scientist, but also a popularizer of science and a philosopher of science. And he talked about science and religion as you might want to translate it. It might work in Spanish. Non-overlapping magisteria. It's like whole
Mhm.
kingdoms that have nothing to do with each other. Sort of like render unto Caesar what's Caesar's and render unto the Lord what's the Lord. Like they have nothing to do with each other. You can be a scientist on one side and a religious person on the other side, and they have nothing to do with each other. But it turns out it's just not true because when you get to things like whether or not there was an Exodus, the Jewish community just finished celebrating Passover. So Passover celebrates the Exodus from Egypt. But then you turn to certain historians, and they'll be like, "Oh, there never was an Exodus. Israel was never in Egypt. There was no slavery. There was no liberation. So the whole story is fiction."
Mhm.
And that's a case where it's like, well, these are not separate realms. This actually matters for faith. If there's no Exodus, then a good chunk of traditional approaches to those stories and to the practice certainly is called into question. So there are people in the Jewish community who think like, well, that's okay. We just need to re-understand everything. If it's fiction, then it's fiction, but I'm going to understand my religion as based on a fiction. For most people, that's too complicated. It's like, what does it mean to celebrate something that never happened? I don't really know what that means. And so one of the things that that means is that many traditional Jews are just very wary of Bible scholars. If you go into a synagogue and say like, I'm a Bible scholar, they're like, oh, I'm not sure I want to hear from you because, you have you might be saying things that make my my previous faith suddenly called into question. There are, the sociology of it is actually really fascinating. There's a really excellent website called thetorah.com, like
Mhm.
so thetorah.com, which is specifically like the whole purpose of it is to introduce critical biblical scholarship into the traditional Jewish community. And they have tens of thousands of readers. So clearly there's lots of people who do want to engage with this, but it's certainly not universal. And there's a lot of discussion as to whether this is good for religious community, bad for religious community, it should stay on the margins. So that's certainly something that's discussed a lot. And I'll say, I think to some extent, it's actually a personal temperamental question. I know people who have learned exactly the same, read the same books, let's say, and one person has a crisis of faith. everything I believed has just come crumbling down. I can't go on anymore. And another person sort of shrugs it off. And it's like, oh, that's really interesting. Anyway, I'm going to go back to celebrating the Sabbath and the Passover because that's what I love doing. So there are all sorts of variables that are not purely intellectual about how people experience it. Sociologists of religion will tell you that actually one of the more important factors in someone's religious life when they're an adult is their relationship with their religious family when they were kids. And you see that also, someone who comes with a strong sense of like their family, their household, the practice, and then they know that they've read things, they know that they've seen on TV or maybe read some articles about how the history is not so straightforward, but it doesn't bother them that much because they're in this framework that allows them to enjoy the religious life. But it's a very complicated personal and sociological question on that side, on the
Okay.
question of like how does criticism affect faith? I know that was a long answer, but I'll just flip it
In in
around.
your in your case, like how do you
In my
balance
case,
faith and
yeah, I mean, I could tell you, if we had many, many hours, I could tell you like my long intellectual journey about struggling with different things. But I'll tell you that I think for me, this is going to sound maybe very dramatic, but I think for me the biggest issues in religious faith are not so much biblical scholarship, but more whether it's possible to believe in a God that's powerful and good in a world with such evil. And I know that's an old question, like the oldest question in the world. Um, but certainly as a Jew, who lived in the 20th century, the Holocaust, the Shoah, sort of overwhelms a lot of thinking about the world and the goodness of the world. And to me, that's actually a much more profound problem than the historicity of the Exodus.
Mhm.
So if I could make my peace with God operating in the world, God existing and operating in the world, maybe I'll say something more about this in a second, but I think all of the specific problems, how could this text say this? I think those are actually solvable problems. Um, when you look at the archaeology more, you look at the texts more, I think there's a lot of sort of sophisticated ways of thinking about them. But for me, the biggest challenge is much more profound about God and the world. So maybe I'll use that to segue to the other half because I think this is actually, for me personally, an interesting experience. Um, the I have not. Sorry, let me say it this way. Most of my work is not apologetics. I don't spend most of my time trying to defend tradition. But because I'm located in Yeshiva University and I have, my students are almost all traditionally Jewish and care deeply about their tradition, um, there have been a couple of times where I've read scholarship that I thought was unnecessarily subversive, like subversive just for the sake of being subversive.
Mhm.
And this stuff matters, right? Like I feel like my students see it and they're like, oh wait, my faith is not on solid ground. These experts tell me that I'm believing in something that's not true. So there have been a couple of times that I have written things specifically to combat what I thought were silly arguments in favor of sort of a cynical or subversive view. So I've actually, some of my colleagues think that Koller, he spends his time defending traditional faith. I don't think that's actually something that I would spend a lot of time on. But when the revisionism is done badly, it's just not actually based on good evidence, then I
No.
feel like, well, no, someone should point that out. Like, now people are being revisionist because it's a cool thing to do, which I think is true. I think there is an aspect to scholarship that people actually do. They look for something new to say, they look for something revisionist to say. They don't want to say the thing that everyone's always believed. Like that's not interesting, right? So they want to show that the traditional belief was wrong. So there's all sorts of examples of this where I think actually in the quest to be revisionist, scholars actually wind up like way exaggerating the value of the evidence or what we actually know. And so there have been times where I've defended the traditional position, which I'm happy to do if I see like that just seems to be where the evidence goes. One question that I don't know if has come up, but there's this long question that's too technical to get really into. The question of when camels were domesticated.
Oh,
I don't know if
yeah.
you come up on the podcast. This is an amazing question, right? Because on the one hand, it's like such a technical question, like who knows camels were domesticated. But on the other hand, you remember, the stories in Genesis, the Abraham's servant when he goes to Haran, he's bringing camels with him, and Joseph goes down to Egypt on a caravan of camels. You have camels like showing up every so often. So if it turns out that there were no camels in the Middle Bronze Age or even the Late Bronze Age, then those stories can't be true because there weren't camels being used to transport goods in that age. So, I mean, the short answer is that there were camels being used, but every so often, someone says like, "Oh, it turns out that there were no camels until like the year 1000 or something." I mean, no domesticated camels till the year 1000, which isn't true. But because the evidence is a little bit complicated, you have some textual evidence from Mesopotamia, you have archaeological evidence, but it's hard to interpret. And clearly, something did happen around the year 1000. Like camels became much more widespread. So every so often people will be like, "Oh, see, it turns out there were no camels, and therefore all of Genesis is fiction." So at some point I was like, "This is actually annoying. Like people
Oh,
keep
yeah.
saying things that are just not true."
I thought that was only in Latin America. I was like,
No. Yeah, no.
it's all over.
Yeah, it's all over, and it is complicated. I mean, it's not a simple question of like there's a fact that everyone's missing. It's more like, well, how do you interpret it? How do you see there are changes, but like, how do you understand those changes?
Yeah,
And
people always think that the archaeological enterprise is just found evidence and I report those evidence.
exactly,
But they don't know
exactly.
that archaeologists have to interpret. They have like an exegetical part of their work when they, have some evidence. They have to interpret that and they come with sometimes hypotheses or facts.
Absolutely.
So it's a really complicated science in some ways.
It is. It's really interesting because it's complicated in and of itself, right? And it's gotten, in a good way, it's gotten more complicated because the methods of archaeologists have gotten much more precise and refined over the last couple of generations. And the hard sciences have gotten more involved. So, things like carbon dating, but there's actually a whole range of techniques that can be used. But even archaeologists, when they're doing the best job possible, that's still not the field of history, right? So archaeology at best can provide really solid data for a historian to then come in and say, "Hey, that's really good data. What other data do I have, right? Do I have textual data? Like, what else do I have? And how do I put that together to actually reconstruct history?" I have in mind certain people who I won't name, who are fantastic archaeologists, who, in my opinion, are terrible historians. They dig really, really well. They produce excellent data, but then they immediately think that they can also figure out history based on that. And they don't know the languages of the various texts. They don't know the methods of textual study. And they're like, "Oh, well, I have this data. Now here's my new historical conclusion." And other historians are like, "Wait, but hold on. Your data is great, but it can be integrated into this different story that didn't need a whole revision." They are different methods, absolutely, absolutely. Sometimes it's also journalists' fault, because they're also looking for new things to say and exciting things to say. So sometimes, like I remember one case where a particular archaeological site had, I'm just fixating on the camels right now, had no camel bones until the 11th century, and then huge amounts of camel bones. So the archaeologists in their article, they were very careful to say, like, this indicates that something changed here in the 11th century. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to say. But when it landed in the New York Times, the reporter was like, "This shows that there were no camels in the ancient Near East that were domesticated until the 11th century, and so the stories of the patriarchs couldn't have been true." And you go back to the original article, and like the archaeologists didn't say that. They said that in this site there were no bones, and they were being appropriately cautious with the conclusions you can draw from that. But the reporter like sees a bigger story there. So it's like not the archaeologist's fault, but what people actually see is that there's this bigger claim being made that then needs to be checked. Then you need someone who can actually understand the data to think about like, well, is the conclusion actually justified based on the evidence? Is that really what we said? Like there is data here, but there's data and there's a conclusion, but they don't always lead to one another. Anyway, yeah. So there's lots to talk about with these examples. I mean, they're great examples. If it's okay, let me just actually say one thing on the other side, which is the question of how being a practicing Jew affects scholarship. And this is again, it's a complicated question. We've moved into in the last generation, right? We've stopped pretending that we're all objective and neutral. So it's certainly more acceptable to say, I come with my identity, I come with my biases, but also, as scholars, we try very hard to be aware of our biases and correct for them, right? I don't want to just lean in and say like, well, I am biased, therefore I'm just going to do scholarship that's biased. Say like, I'm unavoidably biased, and I really want to make sure that I'm checking that and correcting for it. So I think the Jewish tradition actually has built into its approach to texts a method that allows this in ways that not all religious communities allow. So the Jewish tradition has a distinction between ways of reading texts. There's different terminology, so I'll give you two terms though in the Hebrew. One is pshat. Pshat means like the contextual meaning of a text in its own time, in its own context. And drash, which is more of a sort of acontextual, maybe homiletical or timeless interpretation of a text. And for literally millennia, like at least 1500, 1800 years, Jewish readers of the Bible have distinguished between what they would say is a pshat interpretation, a contextual interpretation, and a drash interpretation. So interpreters might say, look, I know what this means, let's say a law. I know what this law means in the book of Exodus. Like I'm reading it in its context. I see what it means, but I also know that that's not how the rabbis understood this law, and therefore that's not actually Jewish law. And we have a distinction between reading a text in its original sense and reading a text in the sense that it means for the faith community. And again, this is, not everyone would say it in the same way, but there's a long tradition of saying that those can coexist. So you can interpret a text in its own original sense without undercutting the traditional interpretation, because there's always an assumption that there are just multiple meanings to the text. There's one rabbinic comment says there are 70 faces to every passage in the Torah. So a Bible scholar can come along and say, hey, all Jews have always read this verse wrong. In its original sense, it means something different. And the Jews can kind of say like, yeah, that's cool. Like, very good. That's another sense, right? Like it's not a challenge to the sense of the text. So that
which is sorry to interrupt you, which is a big difference between Judaism and Christianity, because we are obsessed as Christians to look for the right meaning of the text. Like we can different meanings cannot coexist in Christianity.
Right. And as there's also a difference. Well, I would say that Catholicism is more similar to Judaism in that regard, right? Like, which is one of the reasons that Catholicism was not so happy about people reading the text on their own. But it's also because it doesn't matter so much, right? If the church has interpreted it in a certain way, then that's actually the determining factor. So there are actually Jewish commentaries on the Bible that literally on the page will have the biblical text and then say, here's a pshat interpretation. Here's the original sense, the contextual sense. What did the text mean 3,000 years ago to its original readers? And that'll use, all the tools of modern biblical scholarship, comparative approach, grammar, philology. And then there'll be another part of the page, a drash section, where it's like, and this is what the text has always meant to faithful communities. This is how it could be used homiletically. This is how the rabbis read it. So it's sometimes like very explicitly laid side by side on the page. Like there's different ways to read it, and we're not privileging it. As a reader, you might have your preferred mode of reading. So you might be like, I'm not so interested in the homiletics. I'd rather know what it meant. Okay, that's that side of the page. But the publishers and the editors are like, no, these are both Jewish ways of reading, and we're going to present multiple ways of reading on the page. I should say, actually, the traditional Jewish Bible, this is actually a point that's so interestingly different from the sort of traditional Christian Bible that many of your listeners are probably used to seeing. The traditional Jewish Bible almost always has commentaries on the page, and almost always has multiple commentaries on the page. So like the least educated Jewish household will have a Bible on the shelf. The Hebrew term for this kind of Bible is mikraot gedolot, which literally means something like great scripture. But on the page, the biblical text surrounded by, depending on how complicated, but at least like 3 or 4 commentaries, and they're always arguing with each other. So there's never the sense that the text has a stable meaning that we've agreed upon. There's always a sense that here's a text, and our great sages have always argued about it. So, you can't open it up and get the right answer. Instead, when you open it up and you get like an argument. And you're like, oh, like what? I wonder what the right one is. And there's sort of no choice but to say, I see this person's argument. I see that person's discussions or questions. So like, what do I think? It's an unavoidable part of Jewish Bible study is the multiplicity of opinions. It's like literally in the way that the Bible is presented.
Yeah. Something that is really interesting, at least in the last few months for me, is that seeing some, and I don't want to go deeper into that, but just to mention the point, seeing that some Jews are interested on studying the New Testament. I was at SBL last year, and I was, having lunch in a table, and there were some Jewish scholars in the other side. So I say, what's your name? Where are you from? Well, I'm Fausto from Dominican Republic. So what is your field? Say Hebrew Bible. Oh, another Hebrew Bible person. What is your field? New Testament. So one of them was studying the Gospel of John. The other was actually studying Christianity. So he was going every Sunday to Methodist Church to see how they approach the Old Testament test. So it's really interesting in that.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you, I just contributed an essay to the 3rd edition of the Jewish Annotated New Testament, which is published by Oxford University Press, edited by 2 Jewish scholars. And it's meant both to put a Jewish context around the New Testament, but also specifically, as you said, to get the New Testament more into the hands of common Jews. I mean, not only scholars, but common Jews who should understand that this is part of Jewish history. It's also, of course, the beginning of Christian history. These are not mutually exclusive. But it's also part of Jewish history, and understanding more about the New Testament, the text and the movement behind it and the people behind it is it's a part of Jewish history that's actually not all that well known or documented outside. It's a couple centuries where we don't have a huge amount of other literature, so it's useful for all sorts of things, and it's obviously just so. I mean, I don't have to tell you, but like it's such an important moment in religious history that any educated person, certainly any educated Jew, should be aware of it, should be part of it. I don't teach this, but my colleague at Yeshiva, my colleague Ari Mermelstein, who's been teaching graduate seminars on Paul, Philo, and Josephus. Like each
Mm.
semester, he sort of cycles through so. He works in the Hellenistic world, so he does Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek and Latin really well. And he loves it because, as I mentioned at the beginning, our graduate students are actually from all over the place. So he loves it when like half the class are Jews who know some Talmud and know some rabbinic texts, and the other half are Christians who come in like knowing the New Testament pretty well, but really having no idea about the Talmud. And then he's like, we're studying Paul together, but we're studying Paul in his Jewish context to try to understand, like, where is he intervening
Mm.
in internal Jewish debates? And he's like, the best
Wow.
conversations there. It's so I'm a little jealous that I haven't taught that, but he's much better at it than I am. So it's good. But yeah, it's amazing. It's really there is a like, as you probably know, there's a long history to Jews in modernity sort of rediscovering Jesus and Christianity and being like, hey, wait, this is actually really interesting. But I think you're right that now it's become like very mainstream and in a good way. I mean, I think it's also part of it is that like,
Mhm.
there's also a long Jewish tradition of being terrified of Christians, right? Like, because there's a lot of terrible background on for
Sadly,
many
yes.
centuries where people didn't get along so well. But that's ended. Like, I think at this point people feel like, hey, we have a lot in common. We have a lot in common socially. We have a lot in common culturally. We have a lot in common religiously and intellectually. And so, a lot of the stigma of like, do you really want to study that? After all, that's them, not us. That doesn't exist so much anymore. So now it can be done, freely and with a lot of engagement, and it's great. Yeah, it's
Yeah, I
fascinating
think it's
stuff.
great because, as you said, the New Testament is a Jewish document. And for so many years, Christians have studied the New Testament outside of its real context.
Yeah, yeah. I
And
mean, it goes
disconnected
back to
from
the.
the Hebrew Bible. Actually, there's what I call a new Marcionism in some ways
Hmm,
in Christianity, where people are more focused on the New Testament, forgetting the Old
interesting.
Testament or Hebrew Bible. But there's a kind of a revival and reconnect.
Hmm.
Uh, but that's because for Christianity, in reality, is a continuity,
Yeah.
non
Right.
like,
Right.
and
Exactly.
for that reason, some scholars, including myself, I don't necessarily agree with the Old Testament, New Testament
Hmm.
nomenclature, but there's a lot of tradition going in that direction. There's not a lot to do.
Yeah, yeah. No,
uh,
and I think actually if I could use those Hebrew terms again, the Pshat approach to the New Testament has to situate it in the context of Second Temple Judaism and what's going on, what intellectual ferment's happening, what's Jesus contributing to, and so on and so forth. But there's the Drash approach, right, which is well, I don't have to read it in the first century context. I can also read it as the beginning of a new religion. Like that's also true, and that's also part of what the New Testament is. And I think I would think, I mean, it's not my faith to get involved in, but from an outsider's perspective, I would say these are both ways of reading the New Testament. Someone who says, I'm actually not interested in situating Jesus in his first century context. I'm really interested in situating Jesus in the context of my own Christian faith and in the way that he's been interpreted and read and echoed through the last 2,000 years. But that's also legitimate. That's a
mhm.
perfectly legitimate way of doing it, but they can coexist.
Yes. So let's talk about Talmud. And
Sure.
for our audience in general, let's start with the basic. What is the Talmud?
It's a great question, actually. Partly just partly because the word gets a little complicated. So I'm just going to go with the way that the word is usually used. So today, when people talk about the Talmud, we basically mean rabbinic texts that there's sort of different layers of these rabbinic texts, but the core is a text called the Mishnah. Mishnah means repetition. It doesn't mean that it's repeating anything. It's because the way it was studied was literally repetition. So just recite it over and over and over again. It was an oral text that was studied that way. And that was put together in about the year 200 CE. So if you're thinking in terms of early Christianity, obviously, let's say a century after the Gospels are all written and the New Testament basically exists in its current form already. Remember, the Jewish temple was destroyed in 70 CE. So about a century and a half after that. So the Jews are still in the land of Israel. The center of Jewish population has moved up to the Galilee. And this text, the Mishnah, is really so sprawling, but very, very organized into 6 big books. Each book is organized into smaller books. Each smaller book is organized into chapters. Each chapter is organized into paragraphs. And it sort of systematizes a lot of the Jewish law and tradition that had been developed and formulated over the previous centuries. So it quotes earlier rabbis, but it puts them into one structure, one text. So that's about the year 200. And then over the next 300 years or so, in the 2 great Jewish centers, in the Galilee on the one hand, and in Babylonia on the other hand, rabbis of the following generations essentially use that text as their foundation. They interpret it, they supplement it, they compare it to other traditions that they have, and so they generate new laws and new nuances. They also add in stories and homiletical interpretations. They tie the text back to the biblical text. So the Mishnah mostly does not quote its sources. And then the later rabbis would be like, well, how is this from the Bible? And that whole process, so ending around the year 500 or so, is what people call the Talmud. So there's 2 books called the Talmud, one from the land of Israel, which today is usually called the Palestinian Talmud, and one from Babylonia, which is called the Babylonian Talmud. The vast majority of Jews, when they study Talmud, study the Babylonian Talmud. And that goes back 1,500 years. The Babylonian community was ascendant and dominant as the Palestinian community sort of declined. So it's a text that's not easy to typify, because if you open it up to any page, you might find a whole range of different things. So it might be this earlier text, the Mishnah, with some questions on it. It might be a story about earlier rabbis. It might be an interpretation of biblical verses. So there's all sorts of different genres that are mixed into it, but it's basically the intellectual product of about 400 or 500 years of rabbis in these 2 different centers, studying, discussing, arguing, and then formulating a record of their conversations over those centuries.
Is there any use of the Jerusalem, the Palestinian Talmud outside of I mean, inside of Judaism? Are there communities that use that text? Or is it more used for studying in academic?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's very much on the margins of most people's consciousness. In other words, a traditional Jewish student may never open the Palestinian Talmud. They might if they're particularly sophisticated or advanced, and they want to look things up and find out more about it. But it's really not part of the basic educational curriculum. There's actually other texts produced by the rabbis also that have sort of similar status. So the rabbis produced many midrashic texts. The same people who produced the Talmud also produced midrashic text. Midrashic text means that it takes its cue from the Bible, so sort of organized verse by verse. And it's conventional to talk about legal midrashim and agadic or narrative midrashim. And those also, they're theoretically part of the traditional Jewish bookshelf, but actually very few people actively study them. To be frank, the Babylonian Talmud itself, which is the centerpiece of Jewish education and has been for many, many centuries, is both quantitatively very large and qualitatively very difficult. So just making your way through the Babylonian Talmud once is considered a very significant accomplishment. So for the vast majority of Jews, even educated Jews, getting beyond that and looking for other texts to study is not a common problem. The Babylonian Talmud provides ample material for study for many, many decades of study. There's a whole commentary tradition on the Babylonian Talmud, which is partly because the Talmud itself is often just hard. Its logic is often understated, so they'll make an argument but never quite explain the argument. So just like sort of puzzling it out is a difficult mental task. It sustains arguments over the course of like a page or two, where you have to constantly be going back and forth between one or two or three different positions with different proofs for the different positions, because an earlier text might be authoritative. So like, does this prove this view? And the Talmud might parry it, say like, no, it doesn't prove it. I can interpret it this way, but then goes back and forth, and you have to sustain this sort of logical flow for a long time. So it's actually very challenging, which is why it has this reputation, I think well deserved, as being a very difficult text, very elitist text. Most Jews, if they've studied Talmud, have have strong opinions about it. So some Jews have like very very negative opinions about it, like
Oh,
well, in the educational sense, not in the authoritative sense, but in the sense that like I really don't enjoy it. It's too arcane, it's too complicated. I want someone to just tell me what to do, or tell me what we ought to believe, or what the Bible means. The Talmud is about two-thirds of it is legal in the sense that it discusses laws, but it never comes to conclusions about the laws. So it'll discuss, Fausto says this and Aaron says this, and let's bring proofs for both sides, and then it'll just end. And it won't say, so what do we actually do? Like who do we rule according to? So it's legal in a very strange sense. It's like a discusses law, but doesn't actually lay down the law.
okay.
So that's been part of the attraction of it, because it's really a very intellectual text, but it also, it's frustrating for people. So for today, I'd say in the last century, where all of our education, right? If you think about universities, like in the 200 years ago, so only very, very few elite people went to universities, right? So today it's like much more democratized, and something like, well, people ought to have higher education. The same things happen to Talmud. Like many Jews have encountered Talmud, but it turns out it's not actually for everyone. Like not everyone enjoys it. Not
Hmm.
everyone going to feel satisfied by the process. So it has this very interesting standing in the Jewish intellectual and educational landscape, where it's clearly the centerpiece of the Jewish bookshelf, but that doesn't mean that most people are studying it all the time. And if someone does study it, that's like, wow, okay, that person has, accomplished something serious. But it also means that like, the Palestinian Talmud, for example, like that's already more than most people are looking for.
Is it used in synagogue?
It is not used
Right.
liturgically. It's not
Okay.
used like in any liturgical setting. It's really for study. So a synagogue might also, like any given community, might also have a class on the Talmud, um, which might be at different levels. So there might be a beginner's class, where the teacher or the rabbi might want to just introduce like the Talmud to people on a fairly superficial level, but just say like, hey, it's your book too. So, maybe once a week we'll study one page. And basically I'll read it to you and I'll tell you what it means, and like try to say something interesting about it. Some synagogues might have more advanced classes where if there's enough people who have enough of an education that they can really study it carefully and discuss it, there might be a study group of that sort. But it's outside of the prayer context.
Okay.
There's nothing to do with the prayer context.
And scholarly speaking, what are the Talmudic studies at this point? Like, is it studies
Booming.
only or?
Yeah. It's a booming field, really. It's fascinating. We were talking about Bible for the first half. So in the scheme of things, right, and this is even more true for the New Testament than the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, but the Hebrew Bible, it's a small book, right? I mean, it literally fits in my hand. Um, the Talmud and like sort of all the rabbinic literature is just huge. So much more comparable in size and scope to something like the early church fathers, right? Like many, many volumes that could spread across like multiple bookcases. So there's a lot to do, which means that there's a lot of different approaches, a lot of different methodologies being used. So one that's, been used for, let's say, 150 years, is the historical approach, because the Talmud is very ahistorical in its presentation. They name rabbis, but they'll on one page you'll have like a second century rabbi talking to a sixth century rabbi from someone
Mhm.
400 miles apart, and it's like they really don't care about history. Um, we as modern historians also don't really trust the Talmud as a historical text. So when they say that such and such happened 300 years ago, we're like, did it really? Like, how would you know? And what are your sources? And is this really just being used for ideological purposes rather than historical purposes? So the historical approach to the Talmud is a major field. The textual criticism of the Talmud is a major field. So we have, the sort of on a typical Jewish bookshelf, you can pull off a Talmud that was printed. It's basically the same printing that was printed in the late 1800s. It actually says on the title page, the widow Mrs. Ram had a printing press, and she printed this Talmud, and that's the version that everyone uses. It's as a philological text, like that, it's not all that reliable. Like we do have good medieval manuscripts, so we can, use those to correct the text, to think more about grammar and language and things like that. Really, like newer and more exciting, well, I shouldn't say more exciting because I like those also, but newer are methods of, like, the Talmud does interact with Christianity.
Oh,
So sometimes it does that explicitly. Sometimes, and much more interestingly, does it implicitly. So there'll be stories that scholars today will read and be like, oh, that's really fascinating, because if you're also reading stories like the Syriac church fathers, and then you read the Talmud, you realize that they're talking about really similar things. And often we can see that the Talmud is sort of reacting to things that are in the Syriac church fathers. Judaism, I'll just give you one quick example. Judaism is not a monastic religion. So celibacy was never an ideal in the Talmud. The Talmud actually is very explicit that a rabbi is obligated to be married, obligated to engage in sexual relations. They actually legislate how often they have to engage in
oh,
sexual relations. It's actually seen as the woman's right, that a rabbi may not deprive his wife of sexual relations. Obligated to have children. So family life was always very important. But then there are stories that sort of react to the Christian ideal of monasticism, where it's like, well, because the Jews were clearly like, wait a second, that is actually simpler. And how much better a scholar could I be if I didn't have a wife and kids? If I could just like live by myself out in the desert, like I would be a much better rabbi. So there are stories and other texts in the Talmud that engage with that question, clearly in reaction to the fact that Christianity is around and preaching different values. So that's one field that's booming in a really interesting way. Another is that the I mentioned that about two-thirds of the Talmud are legal texts. It's hard to get a number, but let's say a quarter or so are narrative texts. Some of them are really short stories, two, 3 lines, but some of them like a page, 2 pages of stories. And scholars really hadn't paid so much attention to those as stories. So in the last generation, there's been a sort of literary turn, like the literary value of the Talmud, sort of the like literary approaches to the Bible. So literary approaches to the Talmud has become a big field as well. How are stories told? How are they put together? What literary devices are being used to tell stories, to paint characters, to draw out themes of the stories? So there's all sorts of different methods that are used in Talmudic studies, but generally, unlike the Bible, there's way more material than there are scholars in the Talmud. So it's really not hard to find an interesting research project that hasn't been done previously, because there's so much material, and the number of scholars dealing with it is smaller than biblical scholars.
oh. And what is the relation? Do you see any use of Talmudic stories into biblical studies?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, so it has to be done carefully, but generally the answer is yes. So there's a couple of obvious things. Like, for example, the Mishnah is written in Hebrew. Um, when we study biblical Hebrew, we have a little fraction of the vocabulary of ancient Hebrew. Like it was, it was a language that could have said anything,
Mm-hmm.
but like the word for cat never shows up in the Bible. Like an accident. Like there are no cats in the Bible. Archaeologically, we actually have cat skeletons. Like we know that there were cats in the land of Israel, but they happen never to be mentioned in the Bible. Or like words for tools that show up once in the Bible, but are never explained. The Mishnah is written in a later version, but in Hebrew, and so sometimes just on the level of language, the Mishnah can be helpful for understanding biblical Hebrew. It's something that's sort of interestingly not been done systematically, but you have this whole corpus of ancient Hebrew texts that can help us just understand the Bible textually. A little bit more, vaguely, but on the same sort of method. The same thing's true for law sometimes. So again, it has to be done carefully. But we have whole parts of the Bible where, I'm sorry, whole legal sections, legal topics that are just not addressed in the Bible, right? And I'll give you an example that does come up in the New Testament, like all the laws of marriage and divorce, right? There's basically like one law in the Hebrew Bible about marriage and divorce, which is why it's really open-ended what the Jewish law was on marriage and divorce. And this is, something that Jesus gets involved in, but also something that the Mishnah debates. But there are cases where, we don't really have the laws about a certain topic in the Hebrew Bible, but then the Mishnah fills in gaps. So again, it has to be used carefully because obviously things could have changed over the course of 500 or 1,000 years. But sometimes it can also show us like, oh, this is a heritage from earlier biblical times that's now finally found its way into a text. It's not there in the Bible, but here it is. Here it is later on. We even have a couple of cases, I won't bore you with the details, where we have laws in the laws of Hammurabi, so in 1800 BCE, and then in the Mishnah, very similar laws, but never in the Bible in between.
Mm-hmm.
So clearly, like these laws existed, but they were never written down in the biblical period. So that's one level where like the Mishnah actually preserves things that are useful for thinking about earlier times. Then much more complicated is the fact that the Talmud does engage explicitly with the Bible all the time. So very often it's not what we would think of as biblical scholars as a contextual approach. Like they're not all that interested in the philology, they're not all interested in the grammar of it. So it's not going to replace a critical approach to the Bible. But again, as speakers of Hebrew, the rabbis basically were either speakers of Hebrew or Aramaic at different times in different places. So as speakers of Hebrew or Aramaic, they often did have really good insights into the language of the Bible that's much harder for us as native speakers of English and Spanish. So it can also be used as biblical interpretation, again, carefully. Like it's you can't just replace critical biblical scholarship with the Talmud, but there are places where like, oh, there's an interesting insight here. Like they're reading it in an interesting way that might actually be useful. But then, of course, when that's all in terms of the Hebrew Bible. If you're thinking about the New Testament, so this, again, there's a long tradition of this, but using the Talmud to illuminate the New Testament, again, has to be done really carefully because the Talmud's centuries later than the New Testament. But Christians have been doing this since the 19th century. They're looking at the Talmud and being like, oh, that's what this argument's about, right? Like Jews were arguing about something. Now we understand the background to what's going on in the Gospels or to what's going on in Paul's letters. And that's a different use of the Talmud for biblical studies. Again, all of these things have to be used carefully because we're dealing with texts that are later, trying to figure out what's earlier. So it's not straightforward. But for pretty much all methods of biblical studies, there's some way in which the Talmud can be relevant and useful.
Yeah. Two more questions because I don't want to take a lot of your time. We have already taken a big chunk of it. One, there's some languages of the Talmud that Baraita, Tosefta, can you explain that language for audience that wanted to approach the Talmud in some ways?
Yeah, I mean, certainly. Obviously, there would be a long list. The Talmud is hard. I mean, I have to say, it's hard. It's very, very hard to get into. There's a high barrier for entry. in the sense that the Talmud, anywhere you open it, it already assumes that you understand the Talmud. So there's no like easy entry path. So that, it's best done with classes because you really do need a guide. Even the very first page of the Talmud, like literally assumes a whole bunch of topics and concepts and legal ideas that it never introduced. So it is a very hard literature to access, not just on the level of language, but on the level of concept. So I'll say that as a preface. So I'm happy to comment on a couple of those, but it's not going to be enough to sort of like open the Talmud and dive in.
Mm-hmm.
So I mentioned the Mishnah. The Mishnah, about 200 CE, and then the Talmud develops over the next 300 years. The rabbis up to about 200, that first stage of the rabbinic movement, so about a century or so, or if we think about, let's say, from the destruction of the temple in 70 to the Mishnah at about 200, so 130 years or so, those rabbis are called Tanaim. Tanaim in Aramaic literally means reciters, but that's the term for those rabbis. So alongside the Mishnah, they also produced a whole other set of bodies of traditions that are not in the Mishnah, and those are collectively, as you said, called baraitot. A baraita literally means an outside entity, so it's not in the Mishnah; it's an external teaching. Some of those are collected in another body of literature called the Tosefta. Tosefta means the additional, so it's the additional collection of teaching. The Tosefta in and of itself doesn't have any like authority. It's just like one collection of baraitot. But one thing that the Talmud does a lot is read the Mishnah and say, wait a second, how could this rabbi say such and such? Don't I have another teaching where this rabbi says something different? Or, wait a second, this Mishnah says X, but I have another teaching, a baraita, where I know that that's actually only the view of one rabbi and other rabbis disagree. So what is the debate here? Or what are the views here? So comparing the Mishnah to these quote unquote external, these baraitot, teachings is a big part of what the Talmud does. So people sometimes say the Talmud's a commentary on the Mishnah. That's not wrong. Like I wouldn't reject that. But it's a very strange kind of commentary. It's not the kind of commentary that says, hey, what does that word mean? It's a kind of commentary that says, that's interesting, but how does that compare to everything else I know? And that generates, so it's a much more generative commentary than an interpretive commentary. It's not just explaining what's already in the Mishnah, it's really using the Mishnah as a jumping off point to discuss the topic much more broadly.
So it's assuming that the reader or the one approaching the Talmud have an encyclopedic knowledge.
Sometimes, yeah, very frustratingly, yes. There are times, it'll typically quote the text that it's dealing with, but it's often the case that you really can't understand one passage of the Talmud without background from some other passage of the Talmud, but that's in no order. So it won't explain itself. Now I should say that this is a long time ago, but one of the major revolutions in Talmud study was in the 11th century. The commentary of a French rabbi named who we call Rashi. That's an acronym, but that's what he's universally known as. So R-A-S-H-I, except in French, R-A-C-H-I, but Rashi. And what Rashi did was write a running commentary on the Talmud that in every Talmud today is just printed alongside it. And that did exactly what you were just alluding to, when there's actually no way that you could explain this passage because it assumes something that you've never told me. Rashi, who had studied the whole Talmud, will sort of pipe up and say, like, here's what you need to know. Here's what this concept means. Or, oh, there's this word over here that's not explained, but actually it's drawn from this other passage over there, and there it is explained. So you can actually. So before Rashi, it was literally impossible for an individual to simply open the Talmud and study because there wasn't enough information. You needed a teacher. once Rashi wrote his commentary, it's still very difficult, but now it's possible to use Rashi as a teacher. And when, sort of as you read it, you read Rashi, and Rashi fills in all the background information that's not otherwise known and can sort of guide you along.
Okay. What do you recommend for people that want to, I don't know, any a book or resource for people that want to learn more, get deeper on the knowledge of what is the Talmud about?
That's a great question. There is, as we were talking about, so because the field of Talmud is booming, there's a lot that's being written. So it really depends on what the background is and what kind of questions you might want to know. From within the sort of traditional community, there's a good amount of literature produced for students who want access to the Talmud and sort of want to get going with Talmud study. So I'll mention one name, a rabbi. He was a Russian, grew up secular, and then eventually became a religious. His name is Steinsaltz, and he did a huge amount of work on all sorts of fields, but to open up the Talmud to readers who otherwise wouldn't have access. So he has a book that I think is called something like an introductory guide to the Talmud or something like that. It's not a historical book. I mean, he has a little bit of history in there. It's really not meant for scholars. It's really meant for someone who's like, I want to know the Talmud. I want to be able to read it, but I don't know anything. Like, where do I even start? So he does a really good job of introducing some of the basic topics, like, if you want to know what a Mishnah, what a Tosefta is, he has sections describing what that is, describing how the Talmud works. So it's a little bit of a dictionary, but not in the sort of technical sense, but more like key terms that are explained. But also he has some essays about like, how does the Talmud actually work? Like, what's in there, and what can I expect to find as I go through it? So that's really meant not as an academic book, but as for learners. And I think it's great. I mean, he really does a really good job. I recommend it to students all the time who are struggling because it's just a hard text. So it's he has a lot of wisdom in there that comes from decades and decades of being immersed in it and then trying to share it with people by way of getting them in. More like historical introductions. There's a book. It's called a biography of the Talmud. I think it's called the Talmud, a biography by a scholar named Barry Wimpheimer, which is short, quite good. Situates it historically, talks about how it came to be, and then also how it's been interpreted and used in Jewish communities since in the last 1500 years. So if someone's interested not so much in studying the Talmud, but in knowing more about the Talmud, that's a really good book by Wimpheimer. There's a lot of like books that really ought to be good introductory books, but they're actually just written too academically to do that. So there's maybe for your listeners, it might be particularly interesting. I mean, we were talking about the field of sort of Talmud and early Christianity. So that's, there's a lot of literature there. A colleague named Michal Bar Asher Sigal, her last name Bar Asher Sigal. So she has a couple of books on the Talmud and Christianity, which are great. They're really academic books, so they're not distilling it for a more popular audience. But if someone has access to a library and can take them out, there's just amazing readings of Talmudic stories in there that are really fantastic. And she's very much at home in the Syriac literature and reading what are Christians doing and then how's the Talmud responding. There's a lot of like interesting research being done, but a lot of that hasn't yet been translated into books written really for a more popular audience. One name that I'll mention, but more as a warning, is Jacob Neusner, Neusner. Pretty much anytime you Google, you'll find books by him. He wrote something like 900 books. Yeah, exactly. Including a lot of introductory books. And there's a lot of wisdom in them. He was a very, very smart person, but he also has a lot of idiosyncratic views that no one actually agrees with. So he writes really well, writes really clearly. I certainly wouldn't tell anyone not to read them, but know that like mixed in with his with his sort of reliable scholarship is also a lot of idiosyncrasies that he put into every book he wrote. So it's kind of complicated because he did the best job of popularizing rabbinics for a broad audience, but also had all these idiosyncratic views that sort of most scholars don't agree with, which is really, it's just the scholar's own fault, because then like what they should be doing is writing more introductory books to popularize it. But that hasn't been done enough.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you very much for allow us to have this hour with you, and I hope you can be with us again in the future.
Thank you, Fausto. It's been really a pleasure. Yeah. Hope to continue learning together.
Perfecto.